You will never truly defeat a narcissist by simply fighting harder. In reality, the harder you fight, the faster you end up losing. If you genuinely want to win, you must stop playing the game they created for you. Take a moment and reflect on this. Where in your life are you still reacting instead of responding with awareness? Real awareness becomes your first real power move. Most people assume beating a narcissist means exposing them, outsmarting them, or finally saying the perfect sentence that leaves them speechless. That belief itself becomes the trap. You do not defeat a narcissist by overpowering them. You succeed by disengaging in a strategic way. Overpowering assumes you are in a fair fight, but you are not. A narcissist constantly shifts rules during arguments, rewrites history, denies things said minutes ago, and pushes you until you react. The moment you react emotionally, the focus moves away from their behavior and toward your reaction. Suddenly, you are defending your tone instead of addressing their manipulation. Strategic disengagement works differently. It is not surrender and it is not weakness. It is a controlled withdrawal from dynamics specifically designed to destabilize you. Instead of proving your point again and again, you recognize the circular pattern of the conversation and stop engaging in it. Instead of correcting every lie, you pause and ask whether correction will truly change anything. Many times it will not. A narcissist is rarely searching for truth. What they seek is control, attention, and emotional intensity. When you disengage strategically, you conserve your energy. You decide when to respond and when silence is more powerful. You stop giving long explanations that can easily be twisted or distorted. You reduce emotional access and become less available for unnecessary drama. This gradually shifts the power dynamic because narcissistic systems depend heavily on your emotional involvement. Without your outrage, your tears, or your desperate attempts to be understood, the system slowly weakens. Disengagement may appear as shorter answers, fewer arguments, declining pointless conversations, or sometimes creating physical distance. It requires discipline because a part of you will want to correct every injustice. But real strength is not found in winning the argument. Real strength is found in refusing to fuel a pattern that was never designed to reach resolution in the first place. Emotional detachment becomes your most powerful tool because narcissistic dynamics thrive on emotional intensity. A narcissist closely studies your reactions. They notice what hurts you, what excites you, what makes you defensive, and then they use that information deliberately. The more emotionally invested you are in being understood, validated, or treated fairly, the easier it becomes for them to provoke you. Emotional detachment does not mean you stop caring about people. It means you stop allowing your emotional state to be controlled by someone who thrives on destabilizing you. When a narcissist criticizes you, they are often testing for impact. If you instantly defend yourself, argue, or try to prove them wrong, they have already succeeded in pulling you into their arena. When you detach emotionally, you create space between the stimulus and your response. You pause and observe. You recognize that the comment is less about truth and more about control. That simple pause shifts the balance of power. It prevents escalation and protects your mental clarity. Detachment also helps you recognize patterns rather than isolated incidents. Instead of asking why they said something hurtful, you begin thinking that this is what they tend to do when they feel threatened. That shift moves you away from emotional reactivity and towards strategic awareness. You stop personalizing every jab. Emotional detachment is also internal. On the outside, you may still respond politely or engage when necessary, but inside, you are no longer scrambling for their approval or collapsing under their criticism. You stay grounded in your own reality. Once your self-worth is no longer tied to their opinion, their tactics begin to lose their strength. Without emotional hooks, manipulation has nothing to attach itself to. Gradually, the dynamic begins to change in subtle but meaningful ways. Another powerful shift happens when you stop feeding their need for validation and control. Narcissistic behavior is sustained by what psychologists often call supply. Supply includes attention, admiration, fear, anger, reassurance, and even frustration. It does not have to be positive to be powerful. If they can make you cry, defend yourself constantly, praise them excessively, or chase their approval, they are receiving the supply they crave. And once they are fed, the behavior continues. Many people believe that if they just love harder, praise more, explain better, or prove loyalty, the narcissist will eventually soften and feel secure. Unfortunately, narcissistic validation is bottomless. The more you give, the more becomes expected. Compliments quickly lose their value. Sacrifices slowly turn into expectations. Emotional labor becomes a permanent responsibility. Over time, you may find yourself managing their moods, anticipating their triggers, and constantly trying to keep the peace. The key to beating them at their own game is recognizing that you cannot fill a void that refuses to be filled. You begin reducing unnecessary praise. You stop over-explaining to protect their ego. You no longer rush to repair their insecurities whenever they feel slighted. When they search for admiration, you respond in a neutral manner. When they attempt to provoke control, you avoid escalating the situation. This does not mean becoming cold or cruel. It simply means becoming measured and balanced. You give appropriate responses rather than excessive ones. You stop rewarding harmful behavior with intense emotional engagement. When they create drama, you do not immediately rush to fix it. When they attempt to dominate decisions unnecessarily, you calmly express your position without entering a power struggle. Without constant validation and emotional reactions, their sense of control weakens. The dynamic slowly begins to shift because the reinforcement cycle has been interrupted. Once you stop feeding the very mechanism that sustains their behavior, you begin reclaiming your autonomy in a quiet but powerful way. Another effective strategy involves mastering calm, neutral responses, sometimes referred to as the gray rock method. This approach focuses on becoming emotionally uninteresting to someone who feeds on reactions. Narcissists thrive on stimulation and intensity. They want to see visible impact. Whether it is admiration or outrage, what matters most to them is feeling that they have moved you emotionally. When you respond with calm predictability and minimal emotion, you interrupt that reward system. Gray rock does not mean staying silent in every situation, and it certainly does not mean suppressing feelings in unhealthy ways. It simply means choosing responses that are short, factual, and emotionally neutral. When you sense manipulation and they criticize you, instead of passionately defending yourself, you might calmly say that you see their perspective. If they provoke you with accusations, instead of offering a long explanation, you simply respond that you disagree and leave it there. No emotional expansion and no over-justification. What makes this method effective is consistency. The first few times you apply it, they may escalate. They might insult you more deeply or try different tactics to force a reaction. This is often a test. If you suddenly explode after remaining calm for a while, they learn that persistence eventually works. However, if your neutrality stays steady, their attempts gradually lose effectiveness. Calm neutrality protects your nervous system and prevents you from being dragged into exhausting arguments that last for hours. It also limits the amount of personal information they can later weaponize against you. The less emotional material you provide, the less they can twist. Over time, you stop being an exciting target. When someone who thrives on drama no longer receives stimulation from you, the dynamic begins to shift because the emotional payoff they once relied on is no longer present. Setting boundaries with a narcissist also requires a major mindset shift. Boundaries are not set to be understood, agreed with, or respected by them. They are set to define your limits and guide your own actions. One common mistake people make is explaining boundaries as if they are debate topics. They justify them, soften them, and over-clarify them while waiting for validation. That validation almost never arrives. Instead, the boundary becomes something to challenge, dismiss, or ignore. A boundary is not a request for understanding. A boundary is a clear statement of what you will do if a behavior continues. It is not about controlling their behavior, but about controlling your response. When you expect empathy from someone who repeatedly shows little empathy, you create disappointment for yourself. Narcissists often interpret boundaries as threats to their control, which means they may test them immediately. Testing may involve pushing the same button again, dismissing your concern, or accusing you of overreacting. This is where many people abandon their boundary. They argue to defend it and try to convince the narcissist that the boundary is reasonable. But boundaries are not negotiations. They are statements followed by action. If you say you will leave when yelling begins, then you leave. If you say you will not respond to insults, you disengage when insults appear. The strength of a boundary lies in consistency rather than emotional intensity. You do not need to shout it repeatedly. You enforce it calmly and quietly. Over time, even if the narcissist never agrees with your limits, they begin to realize that access to you is conditional. That realization slowly starts to rebalance a dynamic that once revolved completely around their terms. Another important shift involves documenting patterns instead of arguing about isolated incidents. Narcissistic dynamics often operate in cycles such as idealization, devaluation, conflict, denial, temporary calm, and then repetition. When you focus on a single incident, it becomes easy for the narcissist to minimize or twist it. They may claim you are overreacting or misremembering. In that moment, you may even begin doubting yourself. But when you document patterns, either mentally or in writing, you move from emotional confusion toward analytical clarity. Instead of asking whether you were wrong this time, you start noticing that certain behaviors happen repeatedly. Patterns reveal intention far more clearly than isolated events. Documentation does not always mean confrontation. It simply means observation. You might write down dates, triggers, reactions, and outcomes. Over time, you begin seeing predictable sequences in their behavior. Recognizing these patterns weakens the gaslighting effect because you are no longer relying on memory during emotional moments. When you argue about a single event, you stay trapped in their narrative. When you recognize a pattern, you step outside of it and begin understanding the system itself. Eventually, you stop asking how to win the argument and start asking why you are still participating in a cycle that never changes. This awareness restores confidence and sharpens your decisions because you are no longer reacting blindly. You are responding with informed clarity that quietly changes your position in the dynamic. Refusing to play the roles they assign you is another deeply liberating shift. Narcissistic relationships often operate like scripted dramas with roles such as hero, victim, and villain. You may be placed in whichever role serves their story at the moment. One day you are blamed as the problem and labeled overly sensitive. The next day you are treated as the savior who must fix everything. These roles are not about truth. They exist to maintain control. When you unconsciously accept the role, you begin acting in ways that reinforce it. If you are cast as the villain, you may over-explain or apologize excessively, trying to prove you are not who they claim. If you are cast as the rescuer, you may exhaust yourself trying to fix their problems or shield them from consequences. Refusing the role means stepping out of that emotional theater. When unfair accusations appear, you respond calmly and briefly rather than desperately defending your character. When pressured to rescue them, you resist the urge to overfunction and allow them to face their own discomfort. This may feel uncomfortable at first because it disrupts familiar patterns. They may escalate, criticize, or attempt to guilt you back into your assigned role. But with consistency, the dynamic begins to destabilize. You reclaim your identity from their narrative and respond according to your own values rather than their script. Once you stop performing in a story that was never designed for your well-being, the emotional grip of the dynamic begins to loosen. Redefining what winning truly means becomes the most powerful shift of all. In narcissistic dynamics, people often believe winning means receiving an apology, exposing the truth, or finally making the narcissist understand the harm they caused. But that definition keeps you trapped in the game. Narcissists rarely operate from a place of mutual resolution because admitting fault threatens their fragile self-image. Real accountability requires empathy and emotional maturity. If your definition of victory depends on them transforming into someone capable of those qualities, you tie your peace to something you cannot control. Redefining victory means shifting the focus inward. Winning becomes protecting your mental health and recognizing manipulation without engaging in it. It means leaving conversations that spiral instead of staying to prove a point. It means accepting that closure may never come from them and deciding that you do not need it to move forward. When you redefine success as maintaining your dignity, protecting your boundaries, and preserving your emotional stability, everything changes. You stop chasing apologies and stop trying to win arguments that were never meant to be resolved. Success becomes your calm, your clarity, and your ability to walk away intact. At that moment, the game begins to lose its hold over you because the only victory that truly matters is the one that protects your peace and your sense of self. In the end, defeating a narcissist at their own game is not about outsmarting them or forcing them to apologize. It is about reclaiming your power by refusing to play the roles they assign, refusing to feed their endless need for attention, and refusing to allow their chaos to control your emotional state. It means mastering calm responses, setting firm boundaries, observing patterns instead of reacting to every incident, and redefining what winning truly looks like. Victory is not about changing them. It is about protecting your peace, preserving your clarity, and choosing a life where their control no longer defines you. When you disengage strategically, detach emotionally, and enforce your boundaries consistently, the power dynamic shifts quietly but deeply. The narcissist may still attempt to provoke or demand attention, but their leverage slowly fades because you are no longer participating in the game according to their rules. True freedom and strength come from walking away with your peace intact, steady, unshaken, and fully in control of your own life.